Oh, thank you, Chris. As somebody said after that introduction, I can't wait to hear what I'm going to say. But I am grateful for the honor of weaving you a little tapestry of energy surprises that just seem to be accelerating all over the place. Each of the supposed barriers successively claimed to achieving a secure and affordable and climate-safe energy system is an artifact of siloed thinking, and each of those barriers dissolves when we enlarge the system boundary, when we make the problem bigger. General Eisenhower wisely advised us to make tough problems soluble, not by cutting them into smaller bite-sized pieces, but by expanding their boundaries to encompass more options and more synergies so they include everything the solution requires. Thus, it is easier, for example, to solve the car and electricity problems together than separately. All four sectors that use energy, transport, buildings, industry, and electricity, save more energy faster together than separately. All four kinds of innovation, not just technology, but also design, not only public policy, but also new financial tools and new business models, can combine to create deeply disruptive game changers while the old industries are still putting on their boots. And the supposed handicaps of an all solar and wind electricity supply become advantages when they're matched with the needs of a carbon-free whole economy. What I just said will make a little more sense an hour from now. Let me start this story, as we always should, with efficient use. Saved energy is already the world's biggest energy source. Just the energy saved worldwide since 1990, about 2/3 through smarter technologies, it is now supporting more energy services than oil, and yet we've barely begun saving energy. If the United States total energy use had kept growing in lockstep with the economy since 1975, Americans would have used this much energy. Instead, we cut that use so far by 61%, with a huge cumulative saving. And meanwhile, the renewable energy output doubled, but with 28 times less cumulative impact than the savings. Renewables, though, get virtually all the headlines because they're visible, but energy is invisible, and the energy you don't use is almost unimaginable. And yet, in a recent period, 2014 to 16, the world's saved energy avoided 3 times as much CO2 emissions as all the renewable and nuclear growth did. Saved energy in the last 20 years has delivered half the world's decarbonization. It's officially able to deliver 40 to 70% of future decarbonization. I think all those numbers are quite conservative, but how odd we rarely hear about efficient use. The whole conversation's about supply. Another bit of history. Around 1975, our government and industry all said that the energy needed to make $1 of GDP could never go down. A year later, I heretically suggested it could go down 72% in the next 50 years. So far, it's dropped 61% in 46 years, but just the innovations already added by 2010 can save another threefold, twice what I originally thought, and at 1/3 the real cost. Today, even that heresy looks conservative because optimizing buildings, vehicles, equipment, and factories as whole systems, not as piles of little parts, can often make very big energy savings cost less than small or no savings, turning diminishing returns into increasing returns, as I'll describe next. And vigorously applied, this could roughly quintuple global energy productivity over the coming decades. This peer-reviewed paper explains why making energy savings several-fold bigger can actually cost less, because it uses not more but fewer devices, and not fancier but simpler devices, more artfully chosen, combined, timed, and sequenced. We're used to resources like copper ore bodies or oil reservoirs, finite and depletable assemblages of atoms. But energy efficiency resources, are different. They're infinitely expandable assemblages of ideas, depleting only stupidity, a very abundant resource. So let me give a few examples. I live at 7,100 feet elevation over the hill in Old Snowmass near Aspen, 2,200 meters up, where we used to see temperatures dip as low as minus 47 F, minus 44 C, and yet our house does no combustion. That's so 20th century. Super insulation, ventilation, heat recovery, and big super windows that insulate like 16 to 22 sheets of glass, but look like 2 and cost less than 3, make this building 99% passive solar heated, 1% active solar. And super efficiency added less construction cost than eliminating the heating system subtracted. So we saved 99% of the space heating energy at slightly lower construction cost. And we also saved, by reinvesting that and a little more, 99% of the water heating energy, 90% of the household electricity, for which before we went solar, our bill was $5 a month for 4,000 square feet. And also we saved half the water, and all those savings paid for themselves in 10 months with 1983 technology. Today's technology is a lot better and cheaper. And yes, the same laws of physics apply in Vail. You can do the same stuff here. Now, the central atrium seen here in a February snowstorm, the jungle my house wraps around, has so far produced 80 passive solar banana crops. Somebody said I had really big earphones. And our house has helped inspire several 100,000 European passive buildings, which, like ours, have no heating and roughly normal construction cost. Analogous designs turn out to work well in hot, muggy climates like, say, Bangkok. And about everybody in the world lives in a climate somewhere between Old Snowmass and Bangkok. Integrative design gives lots of benefits for each expenditure. So the white arch in the top of the upper middle photo, holding up the middle of the building, has 12 different functions, but it has only one cost. And the whole building's like that. This kind of integrative design let our Empire State Building retrofit save 38% of its energy, later 43%, with a 3-year payback. 3 years later, though, our cost-effective retrofit of the Byron Rogers Federal Center in Denver saved 70% and made that half-century-old government complex more efficient than what was then the best new U.S. office at NREL in Golden, which in turn is only a third as efficient as RMI's net positive, no mechanicals, passive office in Basalt. And then there's a Bavarian building reportedly using 2/5 less energy still. And yet all these technologies existed upwards of 2 decades ago. What mainly improved is not so much technology as design, how you choose and combine technology. And likewise in muggy India, Rohan Parikh's team built 1.5 million square meters of offices using 80% less energy than normal, with 10 or 20% lower construction cost, but superior comfort and satisfaction. The glare-free lighting, like you see in that big floor plate on the right, is delivered throughout by contract. If somebody gripes and says they need blinds against glare, the architect doesn't get paid. In Europe, industrializing mass retrofits of housing and bigger buildings to net zero energy, that is, producing each year at least as much as they use, and streamlining their finance and soft costs, is now getting cheap enough to finance entirely from saved energy while extending building life and improving amenity and health and value. This whole retrofit from before to after with a six unit row house bolts on a factory customized tea cozy around your house, and it's even been demonstrated to be installable in a single day while you're off at work. And now it's being tested in the US. Similar methods are expected, for example, to cut energy costs 80% and emissions to zero in 9 old ordinary Brooklyn apartment buildings, also taking them completely off gas, making them all electric. And this is being done without disturbing the occupants as an archetype for citywide deep retrofits. Decade-old data reported 8 years ago by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change shows that the best European new buildings on the left and retrofits of old buildings on the right, with bigger savings toward the right in both graphs, could save up to at least 90% of the energy use without costing more per unit of saved energy. So even such huge savings in diverse new and old buildings can be very cheap. Those are the points that are almost down on the horizontal axis. And the big vertical scattered to some of the other points just shows the business opportunity to conform inferior projects to best practices, because whatever exists is possible. As the earth warms and incomes rise, new urban air conditioners could overwhelm power grids and capital budgets, so RMI and Mission Innovation and the Government of India a few years ago launched the Global Cooling Prize, and its results were announced last year. It at least quintupled the efficiency of the best affordable window air conditioners. The two firms that won, one Indian, one Chinese, have a path to market because their combined market share is already 1/4. But there is, worldwide, but there's already an even simpler way, namely good design can first displace refrigerative cooling, like air conditioners. So, for example, these mid-rise apartments that prove popular in the Indian monsoon use passive, convectively vented double walls and super efficient ceiling fans to keep you feeling 29 to 34 Fahrenheit degrees cooler at just 2% higher construction cost. And with a few further refinements, they could deliver decent comfort with no air conditioning. Proven techniques can also profitably at least triple, probably quintuple, the energy efficiency of big commercial buildings' conventional cooling systems. But those mechanical systems may just have become obsolete thanks to another radical development. It's a revolutionary experiment done 3 years ago by some Princeton folks, showing that purely radiative cooling kept people comfortable outdoors in sweltering Singapore, although in the shade, without moving, drying, or cooling the air. Instead, in a shaded but open-ended pavilion, kind of like a bus stop shelter, this experiment cooled people just by absorbing far infrared rays from their bodies into vertical panels on at least one side of them, cooled by surface tubes circulating slightly cooled water and shielded from the human air by a thin plastic film that's transparent to 82% of the infrared that your body radiates. As the extended chart shows, even at 80% relative humidity, radiant temperatures around 73 to 77 F in the water you circulate can deliver comfort in air up to at least 90 F, 32 C. And that mild cooling you need can often be done passively with no electricity by special surfaces that passively radiate infrared into the sky, even in cloudy or rainy weather, and therefore feel cool to the touch when they're in midday sun. The same approach can even give us hot cars with cool bodies inside and no air conditioning. That's a big deal. Most people assume that air conditioning is going to eat the grid. Well, it might not need electricity, and this can probably be retrofitted. What about home appliances? Here's a Swiss fist-sized heat pump that can deliver 6 to 15 units of hot water per unit of electricity. Here's a dramatically more efficient, safe, and superior Swiss electric cooking system using vacuum-insulated pots to cook with 2.5 to at least 4 times less electricity than induction cooktops, supposedly the best thing. So both these offerings are several-fold more efficient than those on the U.S. market. Making electricity affordable to the world's poorest people This 27-watt electric household, even including a 56-centimeter color television, needs a solar panel a third smaller than in the picture, and it cuts the total investment in half. More broadly, if you invest in things to save electricity instead of supplying more, or more precisely, if you invest to make things that save electricity rather than supplying more, you need about 1,000 times less capital, and you get it back 10 times faster. So you need on the order of 10,000 times less capital for the most capital-intensive sector, the power sector, which devours about a quarter of global development capital. Freeing up that capital to fund other development needs is the biggest macroeconomic lever we know for fair global development. What about industry, which uses half the world's energy and electricity? Well, RMI's latest $60-odd billion worth of industrial redesigns typically found about 30 to 60% energy savings on retrofit, fixing up old factories, paying for itself in a few years, and far outperforming the orange zone in the upper left, where most energy service companies deliver disintegrated design. In new projects, again across a range of industries, integrative design generally yielded about 40 to 90-odd% energy savings with less than normal capital cost. To do these things, we just rethought process design and found big savings in traditional but often poorly designed auxiliary systems. Thus, most electricity runs motors. Half the motor power runs pumps and fans. But just better pipe and duct design can save 80 to 90+% of the friction, 97% in my house, and therefore a similar fraction of the pump and fan power. If everybody did this around the world, it could save about a fifth of global electricity, or half the coal-fired electricity, with paybacks typically less than a year in retrofit and instant in new construction. But this isn't yet in any standard engineering textbook, government study, industry forecast, or climate model. Why not? Because it's not a technology, it's a design method. And most people don't yet think of design as a way to scale rapid change. To wring out friction, we simply use big pipes and small pumps, not small pipes and big pumps. Also, by the way, we raised up the pump to meet the pipe instead of dipping the pipe down to the floor to meet the pump. Duh. And then to eliminate any remaining elbows in their friction, we lay out the pipes first, then the equipment, laying out the supply pipes as if they were drains. We bend minds, not pipes. What does such savings mean for the 3/5 of global electricity that's used in motors, have to run pumps and fans? Well, in a typical pumping system, from the fuel burned at the power plant to the end use, many successive losses compound, so only 1/10 of the fuel energy comes out the pipe as flow. But if you now turn those compounding losses around backwards from right to left, they turn into compounding savings, and every unit of flow or friction you save in the pipe saves 10 units of fuel cost, emissions, and what Hunter Lovins calls global weirding back at the power plant. And as you go back upstream, the components get smaller and cheaper, so the total capital cost goes down. Then we could make the motor systems 80 or 90-odd% smaller and at least twice as efficient by a whole system retrofit that doesn't just use the usual 2 improvements, but rather 35, of which 28 turn out to be free byproducts of the first 7. So you can save several-fold more energy at about a fifth the unit cost. So if you combine the pump and fan system savings and the motor system savings, then your savings not currently being counted are good for about a third of the world's electricity. We can also save industrial energy by saving the energy-intensive materials that industry makes. In a couple of papers a year ago, I compiled convincing but scattered literature on how just smarter structural design can profitably save at least half of the world's cement and steel that now release about 15% of global CO2. For example, substituting tension for compression structures typically looks better, costs less, and uses about 1/8 the tons. Pouring concrete not into straight prismatic forms, but into curvy fabric forms can often save over half the concrete by putting strength and stiffness only where you need them. And then, of course, those weight savings compound because you need less strength to hold up less weight. I've become interested in floor slabs, not something I had previously paid much attention to. You know, you just walk on them and don't think about them, but it turns out that if you fold it like corrugated cardboard, a 5 centimeter thick concrete floor slab or a shallow vaulted dome replaces a 30 centimeter thick flat slab. It costs less and it saves 3/4 of the materials. By the way, another application, an airy 3D printed bridge, can carry mainly its users, while massive concrete bridges we're used to support mainly their own weight. And 3D printing's come quite a ways. Here's a beautiful 3D printed stainless steel bridge in Amsterdam. Oh, once you are using thin floor slabs, you can save another 15% of the core structural materials and 3/4 of the energy in a new mid or high-rise building, while increasing net rentable space by a stunning 55%. Anyone here in property development? Anyone in the real estate business? 55% net rentable space does wonders for your pro formas. This is called the 3-for-2 concept. The way you do it, look at the left. Far left is how we normally build, with about 1 meter of mechanical plenum at each story and thick floor slabs. You can design out the mechanical stuff, distribute it into other stuff you're building anyway, use thin floors, and fit 3 stories with the same ceiling height into the height previously occupied by 2 stories. As in the Singapore building done 2015, 7 years ago. Cost and complexity and building time all fall dramatically. So everything gets better. Why would you ever want to build the old way? And remember, the floor slabs are around half the weight of a typical mid or high-rise building. Okay, even without integrative design and without those material savings, U.S. electricity use could shrink 25% by 2050, even if every car is electric and GDP is 2.6-fold what it was in 2010. And this quadrupled electric efficiency would save electricity at an average cost 1/10 what we pay to buy electricity today. So in this analysis, we're not buying nearly enough efficiency. So this could save most of the time and money and hassle needed to install largely or wholly renewable electricity and a lot of those new power lines you keep hearing about. So the well-publicized challenges of vast renewable installations are largely artifacts of exaggerated demand caused by not competing or comparing efficiency with supply. So the well-known Princeton study of how hard it'll be to build all this stuff, especially power lines, assumes 2 to 4 times less efficiency than in our study, and we didn't buy nearly enough. Okay, autos. Integrative design can make our cars and light trucks several-fold more efficient even before we electrify them, and that makes their electrification faster and cheaper. You see, most of the energy you need to move a car is caused by its weight, and saving 1 unit of energy at the wheels leverages another 4 or 5 units of fuel saved in the tank. So I drive a carbon fiber electric car by BMW that was profitable from the first unit they sold 9 years ago, and profitable for every one of the 250,000 units they made and sold since then. They just stopped in June. Its carbon fiber was paid for by needing fewer batteries, the biggest cost item, to propel the lighter weight car. Also, fewer batteries recharge faster with less infrastructure investment and less energy. The saved weight snowballs spectacularly. Assembling the car saves 2/3 of the normal capital and water and half the energy, space, and time. So the saved batteries and the simpler manufacturing paid for the supposedly unaffordable ultralight carbon fiber that made the whole thing 300 kilograms or so lighter. Also, the simpler manufacturing eliminated the two hardest steps in automaking, the body shop and paint shop. It's much better for the workers, and the quadrupled efficiency to 124 miles a gallon equivalent comes without compromise and with a lot of driver advantages. I particularly enjoy half normal turn radius and wonderful visibility. So if you thoroughly apply this design logic, you could save up to about 2/3 of the scarce battery minerals we hear so many scare stories about. And then there's 5 other layers of efficiency that multiply with car efficiency to manage the rest. Oh, that's not the end of the story. It's the beginning. The game's changing again. Consider a couple of hypercars planned to enter the market late this year, both from little firms I advise. Most drivers will not need to recharge this two-seat electric three-wheeler because the 3 square meters of solar cells on top capture enough energy to drive about 40 to 60 kilometers a day. It's as if your present car, if you park it outside, miraculously added a couple of gallons of fuel every day to its tank. So normally you don't need to charge it unless you need to go on a long road trip, but then you can quickly recharge the tiny batteries. You can see in the lower left how tiny they are in the base configuration. And if you want, you can get more batteries and have ranges up to 1,000 miles. And of course, you can also run routinely in places that have no electricity and no fuel. Now, my BMW and Tesla electric cars are among the most efficient you can buy now, but this two-seater is nearly 3 times that efficient. It's equivalent to 343 miles a gallon, and the composite body looks very crash-worthy. One fun number on this, the total air drag of this vehicle is less than that of the side mirrors or the windshield wipers on an F-150 pickup truck. Then there's the Dutch firm Lightyear with a 5-seat four-wheeler, a real car, 450-mile range, light, aerodynamic, 5 square meters of solar cells on top, and it's only 251 miles per gallon equivalent, but it's got more solar, so it can add 8 miles of range for every hour in the sun. So the charging infrastructure that others have to pay for, these super efficient vehicles aim to bypass, and even they can be further improved. Then there's heavy vehicles. The same physics and the same business logic also apply to trucks, planes, and ships. Long ago, we helped Walmart's heavy truck fleet save half its fuel per case, and that included smarter logistics, but now the current technology alone can profitably make heavy trucks 2 to 4 times more efficient than the fleet. And that plus the 3 to 5 times more efficient airplanes in the bottom row designed a decade ago at Boeing and NASA and MIT could move nearly $1 trillion net present value from oil owners' top line back to Americans' pockets and help get the world off oil. You might wonder what's happened in the decades since we invented this stuff at the places I named. Well, what's happened is even bigger potential savings at even lower costs. So Tesla has a battery electric heavy truck that's being customer tested. They put off mass production till next year so the battery and car production can catch up, but it will more than triple efficiency with 40% sleeker aerodynamics, lightweighting that offsets the battery weight so it'll have normal payload, and a 2-year U.S. payback at the pre-war diesel prices. Or, I was recently wandering around in this flight-tested air taxi, which could fly non-stop from Vail to London with 1/6 the operating cost and 1/8 the fuel of a standard business jet. That's not electric. It actually runs on an aluminum diesel engine, Russian design, German made, burning any fuel with one pusher prop. It's a good candidate for electrification, though, and they've already designed a bigger version that could hold 20-odd to 30-odd seats. That's ideal for the emerging trend in commercial aviation, point-to-point instead of hub-and-spoke route architecture. Do you know what that is? So you probably have the experience that if you want to go from A to B, you actually get into plane going to C, where you act as self-sorting cargo at this place you didn't want to go to, and get in another plane going to B to find they lost your luggage. This is not good for customers. It's great for hub monopolists. But, Vail could have flights to any of 5,000 U.S. cities direct, and to most cities in Latin America and quite a few in Western Europe, all nonstop, at commercial ticket prices. Interesting. I think this is about to blow up everybody's business models. And that plane too can improve. For example, 3 years ago, NASA tested a tough, damage-resistant lattice structure, 98.3% lighter than a typical metal aircraft wing. It has the strength of bulk elastomers, but the gossamer density of aerogel. And it doesn't have movable flight surfaces because every part of the entire shape passively adapts like a bird's wing to optimize continuously to the real-time flight conditions. So you have thousands of these identical little molded plastic cells that can be assembled by swarms of programmed robots or grad students, whichever are cheaper, into an airplane of any shape you want with a tough polymer membrane over it. And that opens up revolutionary prospects for lightweighting and aerodynamics and cost reduction. So there have been little prototypes, an airplane for Airbus, a car for Toyota. And you can even make this way a vacuum balloon needing no helium. That is, it's strong enough not to crush, but light enough that when you take all the air out, it's buoyant in the atmosphere. And a big one could lift 24 times the payload of a jumbo jet. And by the way, you can improve the performance of these lattices about tenfold by making them out of carbon fiber, or 100-fold out of carbon nanotubes. Now, autos, meanwhile, are not just heading for 4 to 8-fold higher efficiency, they're also being driven less. A lot of young people don't even want to own one because it's cheaper and easier not to, now that smartphones bridge those once annoying route gaps by summoning ubiquitous transport services on demand. And if you ever do need a car, you don't have to own it, just as you could eat a great meal without having to own the restaurant. In a lot of Chinese cities, renting a Kandi electric vehicle from this giant vending machine costs about $3 an hour. And also, if you rent shared cars when you need them, you can boost their 5% asset utilization by about tenfold. And probably many of you also know there are peer-to-peer ways to rent out your car by the hour whenever you're not using it, and they handle the vetting and insurance and so on. Now, meanwhile, efficient and electric autos are morphing from pigs, that is, personal internal combustion gasoline steel-dominated vehicles, to SEALs, that is, shareable electric autonomous lightweight service vehicles. And those two changes in technology and 3 changes in business model are all simultaneous, they're mutually reinforcing, they're vigorously in play, and with RMI's help, they're sped by smart policies and intent commercial ambitions in India and China. Now, meanwhile, the rules are changing. In 2010, almost half the world's new cars were sold in China, where only 5% of people owned one. And yet this 100-kilometer-long traffic jam took 12 days to unsnarl. Building roads causes traffic, so politicians are changing the rules to ensure that drivers get what they pay for, but pay for what they get. And in fact, in Shanghai, a license plate costs more than the small car you put it on. And smoggy Beijing will register your electric car instantly for free. But if you want a new fueled car, you have about a 1% chance in the lottery to be allowed to buy a registration. And a lot of European cities are actually phasing out cars in the central district. And non-automotive mobility is improving too. Bus rapid transit, which is like a surface subway, transformed the Hangzhou Street on the left to the scene on the right while carrying 800,000 riders a day. So it can give you subway route density at about 5% the cost. And it's now carrying over 30 million commuters in nearly 200 cities. China also has well over 200 million electric bicycles. Now you see them all over the US. The end of last year, Shenzhen had 100% electric buses and taxis. 5/8 of their delivery vehicles were electric, soon all. So that's a city of 13 million people that had more electric buses than the top 5 American urban bus systems combined had total buses. And urban design is changing too. China plans in the next 15 years to build new cities for as many people as America has. So it has been designing cities around cars with an arterial vehicle network and these, 14-lane boulevards you can't get across, chopping the city into chunks. But if instead you integrate and distribute where people live, work, shop, play, pray, it means people don't have to travel far nor by car. And then the city looks like a capillary web. It's designed around feet, not tires. And that gives you 2/3 less driving and 1/3 less concrete and a lot more parks. It builds a human ecology with vibrant commerce, rich social life, equal or better throughput, cleaner air, and happier, healthier citizens. There's over 50 cities now doing this and more to come that will use little oil. So the oil and gas reserves, unsellable for competitive reasons, are now looking bigger than the reserves unburnable for climate reasons. Oil owners are more at risk for market competition than from climate regulation. See, the cost of getting autos completely off oil has fallen from $18 per saved barrel a decade ago to under $7 today, heading below zero in the next few years. So oil became uncompetitive even at low prices before it became unavailable even at high prices. So that's the quick oil story. There's another big energy story, electricity, which is similar, but it's moving faster. We're shifting from molecules and atoms to bits and packets, from hardware to software, from hierarchies to networks. Electricity is changing from centralized, supply-focused, fossil and uranium-fueled and brittle, to distributed, customer-focused, renewable, and resilient. It's starting to become decarbonized, decentralized, digitized, and democratized. And as the chief strategist of the Midwest Power Pool said, we're shifting from forecasting demand and scheduling supply to forecasting supply, renewable supply, and scheduling demand. Not that you'll notice. And the deepest change in the electric revolution is how the information age informs, enables, and organizes customers to take power into their own hands. It's wise to sell customers what they want before someone else does. Customers are figuring out they can buy a lot fewer electrons, use them more productively and more timely, produce their own, and even trade them with each other. For example, Dutch customers for some years now, have been buying renewable electricity, if they want, directly from other customers on this peer-to-peer website that looks kind of like a music file swapping site. It's from Fontebron, literally from the source. A friend of mine bought his electricity from the guy in the upper left photo because the price in magenta is attractive, and it's a really cute piglet. And then he got a long handwritten Christmas card from his electricity supplier. What big utility can dream of such customer intimacy? And the competition is not just between different generators, it's also with an even cheaper rival, more efficient use. As with fuel, so with electricity. Technology and design are both moving efficiency into fast forward. So for example, prior lighting improvements were largely swept away as LED lights each decade got 30 times more efficient, 20 times brighter, 10 times cheaper. And ultimately, as we build them out, they'll save about an eighth of the world's electricity. We've already seen the dramatic savings you can get in most uses other than lighting. I wonder what else changes this fast. Well, the rest of the energy transformation, that's modern renewables. Because LEDs backwards and inside out are PVs, photovoltaics. Instead of turning electricity into light, they turn light into electricity. And PV and aqua wind power costs have plunged below the dashed lines. That's the cost of fossil fuels fed into our thermal power plants, often making our old coal, gas, and nuclear plants uneconomic just to run. So they're exiting the market whenever allowed to. Indeed, powerful disruptors are converging on the electricity industry from at least 8 directions. And these 8 Pac-Men of the apocalypse move fast. They don't just add, they exponentiate. They're not lone wolves, they hunt in packs. They multiply quickly, and they can gobble up half of utility revenues in this decade. Together, they're creating an alien competitive landscape faster than most utility cultures can cope. 8 years ago, all central power plants were called dinosaurs, and the full quote is, "Too big, too inflexible, not even relevant for backup power in the long run." Who said that? It wasn't Greenpeace, it was Union Bank of Switzerland. And now 4 more Pac-Men are coming over the hill, a whole new wave of them. Now the Paris Agreement's aspirational goal, now the core Glasgow goal, 1.5 degree warming, not more, would require closing a coal plant every day to 2040, practically all of them by 2050. And yet the new market prices of renewables now make this profitable without counting the value of avoiding climate change. A couple of years ago, some of my colleagues and 2 other groups analyzed 95% of the coal plant fleet in the world and found that using efficiently structured financial instruments, you could close and replace all the coal plants immediately, in principle, with modern renewables, including battery storage, and it would be cost neutral in 2 years, that is by now, and by 2025 it would be saving over $100 billion a year. And some of the biggest benefits turn out to be in China and India, which build many of the world's cheapest renewables. Now, modern renewables also scale up in a fundamentally different way. You know, we used to build big cathedral-like power plants costing billions, taking a decade to build. But now each year, similar investment can build you a factory that produces each year thereafter enough solar cells to generate each year thereafter as much electricity as your cathedral would ultimately do. So solar output worldwide is scaling faster than cell phones. You can see in this thought experiment, just in the first 10 years, you get 15 times more electricity from solar than from a traditional power plant. And yet we're still told that only coal, gas, and nuclear stations can keep the lights on because they're 24/7, while wind power and photovoltaics are variable and thus supposedly unreliable. But variable doesn't actually mean unpredictable. Here's how accurately the French grid operator in a stormy winter month forecast a day ahead the actual output of the country's wind farms. It would be nice if they could forecast demand that accurately. And a decade later, we're a lot better at it. And indeed, we built the grid because no generator is 24/7. They all break. And when a giant power plant fails, you lose 1 billion watts in milliseconds, often abruptly, and for weeks or months. So grids were built to manage this intermittence by backing up failed plants with working plants. And in exactly the same way, but often at lower cost, grids can also manage the forecastable variations of solar and wind power by backing up those variable renewables with a portfolio of other renewables, all forecasted, integrated, and diversified by type and by location. So in Texas, whose grid has no big hydro dams and is 99% cut off from the rest of the country, a 2050 summer week of expected loads can get a lot smaller and less peaky with profitably efficient use. Then we can make 86% of the annual electricity with wind and solar cells. You can see they're quite variable. And the last 14% from dispatchable renewables, the ones you can get whenever you want, small hydro, geothermal, solar thermal electric, burning municipal and industrial and agricultural wastes, burning obsolete energy studies, burning feedlot biogas. So now you've got 100% renewable supply, except it's not a good match to the dashed line, the load shape. So let's take the surplus electricity and put it into two kinds of distributed storage that are on the market and worth buying anyway, namely ice storage air conditioning and smart charging bidirectionally of electric autos. Then we can get that distributed storage back when needed and fill the last gaps with unobtrusively flexible demand. And now you have 100% renewable power every hour of the year with no bulk storage and with only about 5% left over to make hydrogen or ammonia to decarbonize other sectors like heavy transport and industrial heat. So the economics should be excellent even at today's prices. Now the variable renewables, that is photovoltaics and wind, do require careful grid balancing on multiple timescales, just like other power plants, but with different details. Fortunately, we don't just have one-way bulk storage in magenta, but about 10 carbon-free ways to keep the grid reliable and resilient, make it even more so as it becomes renewable. And here I've sketched them in order of increasing cost. Your actual costs will vary, but bulk storage, like giant batteries, actually comes last, not first, so we don't need to wait for a storage miracle, although some are emerging, and the market isn't waiting. Easing our supply task, the first two boxes on the left, which you might think of as negawatts and flexawatts, efficient use and timely use, are both about 3 times bigger than had been thought, and yet they're cheaper. For example, another little Texas simulation we did in summer 2050. If you take the load in green and then subtract the solar and probably some wind production, but maybe it's all solar, you get what's called the duck curve, where you have to crank up rapidly in the evening as people come home and turn stuff on just as the sun's going down. But if instead you install 8 kinds of so-called demand response, which is convenient and unobtrusive to the customer, that duck curve goes away, the daily load range falls by half, you get rid of 1/4 of the non-renewable capacity, the renewables get 1/3 more valuable, and it pays back in about 5 months. So some grid operators now do this kind of choreography every day. Germany, Britain, and Ireland are half renewably powered. Denmark's renewable percentage is probably well up in the 80s, and already these and some other European countries with modest or no hydropower are meeting about half to 3/4 or more of their annual electric needs from renewables. And yet they're adding no bulk storage, and they have superior reliability. Danish and German electricity are 5 times as reliable as ours. The 99.999% reliable former East German utility, 50 Hertz, was 62% renewably powered last year. They're targeting 100% renewables, all reliably integrated by 10 years from now. So, as my colleague Clay Stranger puts it, the operators have learned to run these grids the way a conductor leads a symphony orchestra. No instrument plays all the time, but the ensemble continuously makes beautiful music. And there's some remarkable speed showing up in some developing countries. At the end of 2018, coal-dependent Vietnam had 0.1 gigawatts or a billion watts of solar power. 2 years later, 16.5 gigawatts, the most in East Asia. It's a third more than the 2025 target they'd set a few months earlier. It's enough to generate nearly a fourth, actually it is a fourth of the nation's electricity once the grid catches up. 9 of that 16 gigawatts they suddenly built was on 100,000 rooftops or similar structures, equivalent in output to building half the nation's coal plants in a year. 72% of those rooftop units were installed just in the month of December, mostly in the last week of December, just in time to get a juicy feed-in tariff, which had a 9-month window. So, isn't that amazing? The grid will be several years catching up with it, and now there's a big boom starting in wind as well, where the World Bank says the offshore potential alone ranges up to 500 gigawatts. Phew. This revolution was almost all privately financed by independent producers under standard power purchase agreements. And, policy is still in flux, internal battles continue, but now some neighbors like Indonesia, inspired by Vietnam's solar revolution, are accelerating their shifts from coal to renewables. And global rooftop solar reached 59 gigawatts last year. That's 30% of all the solar capacity in the world. Rooftop is not small anymore. It's sped also by a very ambitious public-private partnership in China. I want to show you a couple of slightly nerdy slides. Please bear with me. What the International Energy Agency calls the cheapest bulk power source on Earth, that is solar photovoltaics, is still often misanalyzed. The violin plots at the far left of the left graph show that the climate change experts' 28 climate report relied mainly on old predictions of low solar output. But you notice there's 2 red bars up there showing far more solar output. That's because they let the observed solar learning curves, that is, they get cheaper as you buy more, actually operate within their models. The second graph shows how fast, notice the log scales, solar module prices have come down. And in fact, it's 2 curves. Most people use the slower one going way back into ancient history, but for 17 years now it's been going down a lot faster than that. The third graph shows that many of the climate choice models, in fact all the important ones in black at the top, are assuming that solar will cost more in 2050 than it did cost in 2019. And that in 2019 or 20, they cost up to 6 times actual market price. Only the red models at the bottom count actual market price. Similarly, on the right, the yellow frontier is 100% wind and solar electricity with various combinations of wind on the vertical axis, solar on the horizontal axis. But climate policy is still driven by those gray models in the lower left, which count very little solar and wind and therefore think they need a lot of expensive, risky other stuff because they're not counting actual market prices for solar and wind, which show up in the red dots. One more nerdy paper. There's a new Oxford paper extending this argument, and you notice in the far left graph, there are all these little curves for real price of fossil fuel going back 140 years. And they fluctuate, but really they're pretty close to flat. Nuclear in magenta came in, and its cost has been going up. Renewables came in, and their cost dropped dramatically, hence the rapid growth shown in the second graph. Those are both, again, logarithmic vertical scales. And yet, look at the little third graph inset up at the top. Almost 3,000 model runs that are the basis of modern climate policy predicted that photovoltaic costs in the past decade would fall at an average rate of 2.6% a year. The most optimistic said maybe under 6%. The actual was 15% a year. The fastest growth model and International Energy Agency projections are the colored lines coming off the points showing actual price development. You can see they have nothing to do with what's going on in the market. And then go to the right. Those green lines are theoretically predicted floor costs that solar could never get below. Well, the actual solar prices cheerfully punch through them one after another. And what the Oxford analysts found very convincingly is that if you count actually observed market prices, not theoretical predictions, then the energy transition, getting off fossil fuel as little as 2 decades, will reduce total cost. Doing it faster makes it cheaper. The trade-offs that dominate the climate economics literature are not real. Rapid transitions win at any realistic discount rate, and academic economists have spent decades debating trade-offs that don't exist. Now, assembling such opportunities back in 2011, RMI's business and design book, Reinventing Fire, rigorously showed how to triple U.S. energy efficiency and quintuple renewables by 2050. So by then we would need no oil, no coal, no nuclear, at least 1/3 less gas, while saving $5 trillion, assuming all the avoided impacts of burning stuff are worth 0, growing GDP 2.6-fold, strengthening national security, and cutting fossil carbon emissions by 82 to 86%. And yet we found this would need no new inventions and no acts of Congress, but with smart city and county and state policies could be led by business for profit. You might wonder how that's going. Well, the first 11 years of this 40-year journey are pretty well on track, green actual versus blue proposed. I think largely because the private sector smells the $5 trillion on the table. That's exactly what should be happening, and it'll now happen even faster. And these best buys also turn out to be the most effective solutions to the big global problems that hazard every country's security and prosperity. And if you like any of Reinventing Fire's outcomes, you could support that transition without having to like every outcome and without having to agree about which outcome is most important. So I think focusing on outcomes, not motives, can turn gridlock and conflict into a unifying solution to our common energy challenge. Well, then, stimulated by those U.S. findings at the G20 6 years ago, China's National Development and Reform Commission, which runs national strategy, published its roadmap for China's energy revolution, and it details how China can save over $3 trillion, run a 7-fold bigger economy in 2050 than in 2010, but using today's energy 7 times more productively, emit 42% less carbon, burn 80% less coal, and get 13 times more GDP from each unit of fossil carbon. And this roadmap strongly informed the 13th 5-year plan, whose energy authors happen to be our steering committee, and the 14th plan continues this line. So if you extrapolate the on-track U.S. adopted Chinese, and they're ahead of schedule, and similar European findings to the other half of the world, you could get to a 2-degree climate target about $18 trillion cheaper, And if you reinvested some of that in natural systems carbon removal, you could get to 1.5 degrees with trillions of dollars left over and huge progress on the Sustainable Development Goals. I think making climate protection not costly but profitable ought to simplify the politics. Here's the bigger picture. Climate science models have conservatively understated the speed and the runaway potential of climate change. But climate policy models, or climate choice models, almost unnoticed, have conservatively understated what we can do to stop climate change. If you offset those two biases, what Jeremy Grantham calls the race of our lives is very much on, and despair and complacency are equally unwarranted. The combined effects of efficiency and renewables in recent years' markets put us about on track for 2 degrees. We need to double the pace for 1.5 degrees. And to do that, we can now enlist a very powerful ally, and that's the dynamics of financial capital markets. You know, feeling the competitive threat, the incumbent energy suppliers are understandably focusing on the need for price to exceed cost. They're doing pretty well at that right now. But many seem to be forgetting the other part of the business condition, that value has to exceed price. If competitors offer a superior value proposition and run off with your revenues, it doesn't matter if you can profitably sell what your former customers are no longer buying. In 1900 in Manhattan, you had to look hard for the first car. 13 years later, you had to look harder for the last horse, because Ford's Model T got 62% cheaper in 13 years. Car-owning households soared from 8 to about 60% in a decade, 3/4 financed by a GM and DuPont innovation called car loans. Well, today our solar modules just got 80% cheaper in 5 years. 3/4 of our rooftop solar is innovatively financed. And Ford's and Edison's industries are merging to eat Rockefeller's industry. So the pace of transformation is set not by incumbents but by insurgents. They're not inhibited by legacy assets or business models or cultures. It's worse than that, because investors flee before customers do. Capital markets keenly sniff out disruption. And once they think you're in or even headed for the toaster, they get that whiff of burnt toast, you know. They don't wait for the toast to get done before they decapitalize you and invest in your successors. So trillions of dollars have already prudently fled the fossil fuel industries as they hemorrhage capital and talent and political clout. Late last year, before the war, the world's top 16 listed hydrocarbon companies combined were worth less than Apple, and most or all of the world's significant automakers together were worth less than Tesla. Now, Carbon Tractor, now RMI investment analyst Kingsmill Bond, explains this brutal logic of the capital markets. He says any fast-growing challenger will rapidly take all the growth in a slow-growing market. And as a rule of thumb, incumbent sales will peak when the challenger gets to about 3% market share, as in these historic examples. Why is that? It's because investors don't just want size, they want growth. So they try to sell just before sales peak, and then stagnation strands assets and competition drops prices. So that's why the coal industry by 2020 had lost 3/4 of its world market value, 99% of its US market value. But until temporarily interrupted by Putin's war, this collapsing value was spreading to oil and heading next for gas. And once the dust settles, those fundamentals will reemerge. You see, peak nuclear energy, peak coal use, peak auto sales, peak fossil electricity have already happened. Fueled autos are now in their 5th year of shrinking sales because electric cars took more than all the growth. And now renewables grew faster in the pandemic, even as it crushed fossil demand. And now renewables are adding over 300 gigawatts a year. So as demand recovers, renewables are expanding enough to supply any future growth, as indeed they did last year, tipping fossil fuels into permanent decline. Therefore, It's a pretty good bet that peak oil, peak fossil fuels, and their peak CO2 emissions probably all happened in 2019. Let me help you visualize that and see how peaks work. This is a respected 2020 forecast, and more are now looking like this. The bottom three wedges, coal in black, oil in red, gas in gray, all stagnated before the pandemic, whose economic shock in 2020 shriveled fossil fuels, while renewables, mainly wind in blue and solar in yellow, grabbed the capital and ran. And total energy use might still go up a little, but so far, it's still below 2019 levels, but wind and solar are supplying more than all the growth, turning coal, then oil, then gas into sunset industries. And of course, efficiency and renewables reinforce each other. Efficient use makes renewables gain share faster. Efficiency outcompetes fossil fuels sooner. And BP's data book out a few weeks ago shows these trends continuing in 2021. And today's fossil fuel price spikes will, of course, reinforce them. We're not going to buy lots more energy just because it's more expensive. Doesn't work that way. Today, we actually have what amounts to a global carbon tax, much bigger than most economists wanted to protect the climate. It's a lousy tax design. It's done the wrong way. It's going to the wrong place. It's causing a lot of hardship, but it will speed the journey beyond fossil fuels. And indeed, as some colleagues and I explained in April, Putin just blew up the fossil fuel era, along with much else. This is a conceptual sketch showing how the pandemic shifted the world's fossil fuel trajectory to a little lower one, but still a bumpy plateau and a gentle decline. But now Putin's war, which I call that to make sure responsibility rests where it belongs, has triggered a European and American-led response likely to trigger a steep decline like the plummeting blue curve. That is, Putin has set inexorably in motion all the outcomes he dreaded, but he's also sped the end of the fossil fuels that underpin his power. And if we continue to grasp this unique opportunity, as Europe is doing with impressive focus and resolve, then Ukraine's agony will not have been in vain. One last thought. This global energy transformation is not just fundamental, it is elemental. The first industrial revolution was the age of carbon. It built our prosperity and the world's mightiest industries from coal and oil and gas. But now that obsolete age of carbon is giving way to the modern age of silicon. Silicon microchips and telecommunications and software turn people from isolated to networked, systems from dumb to smart, grids from analog to digital, and potentially from dirigiste to democratized. Silicon power electronics make electricity interconvertible and precisely applicable, replacing fiery molecules with obedient electrons. And silicon solar cells enable the ascent of energy from mining the fires of hell to harvesting the breath and radiance of heaven. So our responsibility and opportunity is to help enable the new energy system, not protect the old one, to build back better, to move fast and fix things. So the global energy transformation can move at the pace and the cost of design and of software, not of infrastructure, and can be not constrained by the inertia of incumbents, but sped by the ambition of insurgents. I think I see a few insurgents here today. Thank you all for your good work and your kind attention, and let's see what's on your minds.
I actually would like to ask the first question. I don't ever do that, but...
So you can model this behavior.
Yes. So...
It's like that, that was the best introduction I've ever had, except the one where somebody said, Amory Lovins needs no introduction, and then actually sat down.
Next time. So, an amazing amount of information and a lot of really positive ideas here. My question is, what do you see as the largest stumbling blocks to us actually achieving this?
Oh, that most people don't yet realize this is happening or is possible. So I'm glad you're here. Got to start somewhere.
I'd be curious to hear a little bit more about nuclear, and if you have any disparaging or otherwise remarks about that, especially considering all the money that's being spent on small nuclear reactors.
Yeah, the reason I didn't talk about it is that it has no business case and no operational need. So what's the point of wasting time and money talking about it, let alone trying to prop it up? It has, in a good year, under 0.5% share in the market for net increases in global generating capacity. Most years, its share dwindles because its capacity dwindles. More plants are retiring than are being added in most years. And that's because most of them are uneconomic to run or often to fix because they're old. It's kind of like an old car. More expensive stuff goes wrong. We see this very dramatically now in France. They have something like 63 gigawatts of capacity, of which about 25 is working. And a little of that is leftover pandemic delays in some refits they were doing for longer life, but most of it is actually from newly discovered and quite serious corrosion. And the result of that is that Europe has probably wasted much more gas making good the French nuclear shortfall than the European shortfall in gas storage as of this early spring, say March. In other words, European energy security took a big hit, and France has more nuclear capacity closed for inspections or repairs than Germany has shut down cumulatively since 2020, except that the Germans built a competitive, diverse power system which gives them much better energy security. And I think the risk of the lights going out this winter is much greater in France than in Germany. The small modular reactors are the latest shiny object from the same people who have not delivered on their previous promises, but it has a lot of adherents who, on the whole, don't know much about it but think it sounds good. Smaller units, although not small, a few hundred megawatts each, which is like our early commercial power reactors, but mass-produced. The trouble is, aside from their having some novel and worrisome safety and waste and proliferation problems, let's just stick to the economics because they fall at the first hurdle, just as big plants do. I think it's generally agreed that because reactors don't scale down well as a matter of physics, small ones will initially produce electricity at roughly twice the price of today's big ones. Today's big ones are a factor 3 to 13 costlier per kilowatt hour than unsubsidized wind and solar, according to folks who very carefully track market prices like Lazard or Bloomberg New Energy Finance. And then by the time you could build some small modular reactors and see if you like them and consider building a plant to actually mass produce them, the renewables will be another factor 2 cheaper. So you do the math, 2 times 3 to 13 times 2 is a factor roughly 12 to 52. You're not going to get that out of mass production. And that's just magical thinking. And I think it's a straw in the wind that the proposed modular system to be built largely with federal money, our tax money in Idaho to serve small Utah Utilities has already lost over half its customers, and I think it'll lose the rest if they read the IEFA report that actually read the fine print in their contracts and found that they bear all the risks of non-performance or cost overruns. Yeah, so there is not a there in business case for any kind of nuclear power. It doesn't depend on size or technology. So I think it's just a distraction, but it's a big distraction, and it turns out that actually just operating existing nuclear plants for the most part, let alone building new ones which cost a lot more, saves less carbon per dollar because it's more expensive per kilowatt hour than competitively procuring efficiency and renewables, also carbon free, to do the same thing. But it blocks them from the market. It occupies the market space. It ties up grid capacity, so they can't contest that market space as long as you keep subsidizing old nukes so they can't exit the market as obsolete technologies are supposed to. If we let them do that, then there's very good state data now showing that after a year or two, they fill that role, they end up saving then more carbon over time, and you end up with a more climate effective solution. Nancy Clanton, arguably the world's best efficient, beautiful lighting innovator.
Thank you, Amory.
We're honored you're here.
My question is on efficiency, and what is the prediction of efficiency to change all of our electrical distribution to DC so it matches the renewable energy? Like, if panels are producing 380 volt, if we could change everything in the building and appliances. You did show some appliances, so I'm just curious in what that additional savings may be.
Well, there's an interesting new NREL paper last November which showed that if you apply quite conventional building retrofits systematically, it would change the behavior of buildings partly by making them change temperature more slowly because more heat is effectively stored in their mass compared to the reduced losses to the outside. That you could actually reduce long duration storage to or close to zero. So the long-term investment we're told we have to make in long-term hydrogen storage in case of bad weather actually goes away in all the key regions, and in general the investment goes down by at least a factor 10. Now, as you know from lighting controls, smarter buildings put a lot less load on the grid, which means our existing distribution capacity, where we spend most of the capital, can last longer, can serve more customers meanwhile, and can be run more reliably because it doesn't overheat so much. And smart utilities that will actually start at that end of their investment and kind of turn themselves inside out. They'll say, in what distribution area are we about to spend a bunch of money on a new transformer or cable or substation? Let's look at what's causing the peak load in that neighborhood, this much commercial lighting, this much residential water heating, and so on, and focus our efficiency and demand response like a rifle, not a shotgun, on those uses in that neighborhood, with the aim of deferring or avoiding distribution investment and costly investments further upstream in transmission and generation. Well, that experiment's been tried in at least 3 places, and in all of them, you didn't need more more transmission or generation. The distribution investment was indeed deferred or avoided, and the capital spend went down by tenfold. We have a lot of work to do, and since buildings use 3/4 of our electricity, that's a really good place to start.
Thank you, sir. Insightful discussion. My question kind of centers around, given that we have baseline oil and gas demand probably through 2050 to 60 due to the petrochemical complex, what do you think is the best avenue to decarbonize those assets? And do you think the integration of decentralized wind, both floating and onshore, is a viable method?
Well, offshore wind is going to be a big deal, and the first unsubsidized one was just hooked up to the grid. But the forecasts of most of the oil majors still show enormous demand for petrochemical feedstocks. I'm quite skeptical about that because everywhere you look in basically plastics, they're challenged to sustain the markets they have, and there's been huge overbuilding of ethylene plants and other major capital items to make more and more of various kinds of plastic. I think the movement to stabilize and reduce plastic use and keep it out of the ocean, out of our lungs, out of our soil, is going to gain momentum quite rapidly as we discover where all that stuff is going. And there are also, of course, a lot of ways to reduce or eliminate single use, improve recovery and recycling. All of these things come together to, in my mind, cast serious doubt on the forecasts of big petrochemical use. Sir?
Yeah, my only comment on that is what about the pharmaceutical complex and the need for benzene?
Pharmaceuticals are, by definition, extremely small volumes. You know, you're taking little teensy pills. You aren't going to find much hydrocarbon or carbohydrate molecule going to make those drugs. I've worked in that industry, and they spend a lot of money, but it's not mainly on bulk feedstocks. What's more interesting is the food system, and I think we will find, as BASF is also already showing in Europe, that, yeah, of course it's disruptive to lose a lot of Ukrainian and Russian fertilizer production, but we have a lot of fertilizer elsewhere in the world that can substitute a lot of it from the U.S. made of cheap gas under long-term contracts. And the major producers just move the stuff around from where it is to where it ain't. And meanwhile, some farmers are figuring out better how to emulate natural systems, and then they don't need the fertilizer. Sir?
Germany and others in Europe have clearly stated publicly that they need some significant amount of time to stop using Putin's energy. Are they overstating that issue? And how much have they this year accelerated their transition to other forms of energy?
Well, it's not winter yet, and we don't know how cold winter is going to be, and it's a little early to tell how the forecast will turn out. But following some of the threads written up in the Financial Times, which then link in a story today actually to some excellent sources for practical examples of unexpected substitutions. My feeling is that the substitution will be less disruptive than most people now assume, and will cut the economic harm from any winter fuel shortages in Central and Western Europe probably also Eastern, by a factor of roughly 3 or more. Part of that is because big firms like Mercedes are taking part in the reverse auction, where they take gas they'd contracted for and they're selling it back into the market at a higher price. And we'll see where that market clears. But if there's a scarcity, that's what you do. And then you share the scarcity through the market. And they're already finding, hey, we can run our paint shop in Sindelfingen without using any gas. And this glass company already shifted from heating their furnace with gas to using light fuel oil. And there's so much of this stuff going on as people realize, yes, that is a wolf at the door, or a bear at the door, that I think we'll find the system's a lot more flexible than the initial scary lobbyist messages conveyed. That's not to say there won't be hardship, but I think it will not be catastrophic except to Putin's cash flow. And what I would suggest, if any of you would like to do this here or tell your friends in Europe you're doing it, is have an army of grandmas initially knitting cheery yellow and blue woolly caps, because you can save about 15 or 20% of Russian gas in Europe by turning down the thermostat without discomfort if you wear the cap. Well, the rest of your body is clothed, your head and neck are not. They lose a lot of heat. And the average European thermostat's about 22 C. Each degree you turn it down is about 6% of last year's Russian gas import volume. I was just spreading this message in Sweden, which has the same nice blue and yellow colors as Ukraine, so they can show national pride and solidarity with Ukraine with the same cap. And I wouldn't be surprised if businesses started to put in their windows, or households to put in their windows, this is a Putin-free business or operation. We're not buying his stuff anymore.
And so now we want to thank Amory. Let's please give him an incredible round of applause.
Thank you.